participation and connect it really strongly, connect the concept of meaningful participation with equity. But we felt that there's this a connection between meaningful refugee participation and localization that has been left unexplored. And that there has been a default orientation to the conversation about meaningful refugee participation that is global in scope. And there is value in this global meaningful refugee participation, of course, but our experts in the previous sessions made it clear that we need a world where local leadership has a central role in pursuing change. And that we need to have a conversation about meaningful participation that happens at the local and national levels, because this is where concrete change on people's life happen locally. And this has been made clear by our experts, for example, Samara Hakim in session 1, who spoke about how cultural knowledge is crucial. Hafsar Tamaseddin in session 2 spoke about being sick of seeing themselves in global panels and the need for community representation. Deepa Nambiar and Bakir Bayani spoke about the need to orient partnerships to local context. Hane Ostrom spoke about Gaza being forgotten by the global stages and the need to get political. And Maya Hassan spoke about the need to imagine a world in which there would be no need for international humanitarianism. We observed a second default orientation to the conversation about meaningful participation that suggests that the end goal of advocacy for meaningful participation should be representation in humanitarian spaces, and particularly in global spaces. And this has value, of course, and our experts in today's sessions will touch on this value. But in this session, we will also explain why and how we can focus on local level efforts for meaningful refugee participation, resulting in changes not only in the humanitarian sector or in the refugee response, but in society at every level. So this can be advocacy campaigns, movement for changes, local leadership in building better policymaking. And if we do not focus on this, we risk ending up perpetuating a sector that uplifts those without the positionality to impart change. And so a caveat here is that we're not saying international actors are not important, but how they operate must change, we have recognized. So about today, for the agenda of this session, really quickly, so we're going to draw connections between meaningful participation and localization, why it is important, and how to reinforce this connection. The first panel is going to speak about the why of this, and the second panel will touch on the pathways to implement necessary changes. You'll have interactive moments, including pools, Q&A session, and breakout rooms. So I'd like just to announce speakers before we start. So we have 3 incredible speakers here to guide us in our learning. And I'd like to introduce you to them and then move us to our first panel. So first, I'd like to introduce you to Miles Tanhira. Miles Tanhira is a Zimbabwean Swedish international migration researcher and an activist with a forced displacement background. He founded Queer Station Media in 2017, a pioneering transnational platform documenting the experiences of trans diverse individuals in Sweden, the diaspora, and Africa. His recent study, The Invisible Outsiders Within, explores the integration of African transgender migrants in Sweden. Miles has been a consultant for the Council of Europe on LGBTQ refugee rights and authored submissions on LGBTQ migrants' realities. He has directed films and co-authored publications focusing on LGBTQ asylum seekers. Miles has received recognition for his work, including the European Parliament Intergroup on LGBTQ Rights Go Visible Award, and he's being acknowledged as a global innovator by the Human Rights Campaign. Currently, Miles serves as a senior program officer at TGEU, managing the European Trans Refugee Network. He holds advanced degree in international migration, ethnic relations, political science, and communication science. Welcome, Miles. Then I'd like to Then I'd like to introduce you to Ana Maria Diaz. Ana Maria Diaz is the president of Coalition for Venezuela, the largest network of Venezuelan civil society organizations spanning 23 countries. The coalition strives to promote and defend human rights, coordinating a comprehensive response to the complex humanitarian emergency emanating from Venezuela. A lawyer by profession, Ana Maria holds a master's degree in public management, as well as several certificates in migration and human rights. Ana Maria has 9 years' experience in the humanitarian field. She worked with indigenous communities in southern Venezuela, is a former humanitarian protection manager for Help Age International for Latin America and the Caribbean region, and has led programs in Haiti, Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela. Throughout her tenure with the coalition, she has led various leadership positions, including country coordinator in Venezuela, vice president, and president-elect for 2022-2024. Ana Maria leads the representation in the Refugee Advisory Group for Resettlement and Complementary Pathways in UNHCR, and also represents Coalition for Venezuela in UNHCR's Global Advisory Board. She's also a Refugees International Fellow, and she won awards as the Young Social Entrepreneurship Leader 2022 for Ernst & Young firm, and 2024 Macal Pierpaoli Humanitarian Award. Welcome, Ana Maria. And lastly, I would like to introduce you to Amy Fu. Amy Fu is the current project manager at Safe Passage Fund, a participatory and grassroots-centric fund seeking to reparatively shift power over wealth and build connective, organized power for migrant justice across and beyond Europe. Amy coordinates grant making, leads board meetings, and develops programs, partnerships, and communications that align with the fund's vision. Welcome, Amy. So I'm going to kick us off with our first panel. And right after the panel, we'll be doing an interactive exercise. So you can join us at slido.com and put this code that you see. My colleague Diana will also put the details in the chat box. So we have such an amazing first panel today. And with that, I'd like to kick us off on this first panel, turning first to you, Ana Maria. Ana Maria, you run Coalition for Venezuela, which is the largest network of Venezuelan civil society organizations who have uplifted RLOs in numerous countries and RLO's advocacy. So can you unpack for us what is the value of supporting localized refugee-led advocacy, and why do you believe it should be prioritized by every international organization that is advocating for meaningful participation and supporting meaningful refugee participation more broadly?
Well, thank you so much, Julia, for that question. And I will say that this way to explain this is it's the right thing to do, but also the smartest thing to do, because there is no way on earth that you can supplant lived experience. So we are the ones that have lived through all of this crisis. We know how does it feel in our own skin, and by including people with lived experience in this meaningful refugee participation spaces, in giving them voice and make them part of the solutions, is the only way easy to overcome those challenges from the inside. And this comes from our own experience, but also, among other things, because when social times moves differently from the political times, this can imply so many times that an answer that comes from a person with lived experience can save many lives. And we understand the urgency of finding accessible and adaptable solutions. But in addition to this, it's from a pragmatic point of view, because with more and better results we can achieve, and I mean every single stakeholder included in finding a solution, in the less time we can make that, when attention is paid to the advocacy made by the RLOs raising those flags, it's about achieving goals more easily, and it's in everyone's interest. So in addition, is from an ethical point of view, all decisions that impacts directly to our lives should include us. So it's not about us being like a mantra for a meaningful refugee participation pledge, nothing about us without us. But it's remained the pending question of sometimes in so many of those spaces that you were mentioning in the first webinars, what does a meaningful participation means for us? For some of us, maybe increase the participation in number of affected populations in a room. But for many others, this could include a great number of our proposals being implemented with us through all the process.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ana Maria. I want to turn to you again with a second question to continue a bit deeper on the value of local efforts in influencing laws, policies, practices, behaviors, and ultimately the well-being, the concrete well-being of people. With Coalition for Venezuela, you have led both global advocacy for meaningful participation, but also local advocacy around specific issues of interest. And when we were preparing for this, we've come to a conclusion that increased focus on global advocacy for meaningful participation and representation is, of course, undoubtedly important, but it has some limits in leading to solutions at the local level. So I want to ask you, how do these things fit together, the global and the local? And what do such global initiatives achieve and what do they not achieve?
Well, I think that what they have achieved is enhance the participation itself in many spaces. If we compare 2019 from the last Global Refugee Forum, from the last one, it has increased. But it all goes to the ground. What happens, for example, in right now in Gaza, it's very different approach of what's happening in the Darien Gap, in the border within Colombia and Panama. So those issues should be addressed, paying attention to those that are based in the place, that knows the context, knows the affected population, but also knows how to those big solutions and those big discussions at a global scale can cascade down and can impact meaningfully in changes locally speaking, because sometimes we see, and I have seen this in so many advisory boards, some disconnections about what's in the discussion in the global sphere and what's really happening in the dialogues with local governments, that it's filed so separate. So including those voices has to go through a more comprehensive way to include people, very humble people, very localized people in those conversations and giving them a space in the table. I know it's not easy, but we have so many structures all over the world that can achieve that.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria. I really appreciate how you laid this connection between meaningful participation and localization. Now I want to turn this to you, Amy. Thank you so much for being here and for bringing the founder's perspective here to the table and to the conversation. Ana Maria explained the importance of uplifting local advocacy, and Safe Passage Fund is a participatory fund whose DNA is to resource grassroots movement for change around migrant justice and enable communities to develop their approaches and their solution autonomously. So can you help us understand first, why is it your approach? Why Safe by Safe Fund supports local movement for change? And from your perspective as a founder, can you tell us what is the impact of such approaches and what makes your support transformative?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Julia. And thanks everybody for joining today. So Safe Passage Fund is quite a unique model, which unfortunately is not the norm yet within the philanthropic world. So we were created almost as like a natural reaction from activists themselves. In 2019, a German activist was criminalized for helping migrants reach safe haven within Europe. And then from that event, 1 million euros were kind of crowdfunded altogether. And what happened was that representatives of different existing organizations came together and decided on a democratic decision-making process in which one representative from each organization would be able to control and decide on where the funds go. So as a result of this natural process, what we mean by meaningful participation is not only that grassroots grantees can receive funding, but also that the people who make up those communities are actually involved in our decision-making themselves and have power over influencing where and how funding is streamlined. So for that reason, we have a participatory board, currently consists of 5 feminist activists with a wide diversity of lived experience as well as learned experience, and they're located both within and beyond Europe to help us achieve our goal of building collective organized power to dismantle the harmful root causes and also harmful impacts of the European migration system and to build collective organized power for migration. We think that having this kind of participatory board offers really unique insight into being prepared and knowledgeable about where funding should go in order to make the strongest impact and the most resilient systems change. So why specifically local movements for us is has many different factors that are relating to it. On the one hand, we believe that local movements are actually the fundamental building blocks for a larger system change, right? So human relations always come on the small level between each of us, and we want to build trust and accountability, and that can't happen just through a large top-down approach, but rather building from the bottom up. At the same time, there are multiple migration policies that often can be targeted at the local level. An example would be within Europe, if you're located there or you know about this context, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there were many kind of different discriminatory policies regarding, for example, people without Ukrainian citizenship who had nonetheless fled the invasion. And often the ability to change the policies regarding that happened on a citywide or a localized level. And that's a great example of how we can piece by piece kind of dismantle these larger systems. At the same time, we always want to be community accountable. It's how we were created. We came as a natural reaction, and we want to keep this vision and these principles all the way through as we developed and change. It's not a perfect process, of course. We're very transparent about our imperfections and embracing the complexities of this process. But we believe that local initiatives are always crucial because they are connected to personal relations between communities, and they create these bonds that go actually beyond something that can be concretely measured or only seen within the terms of finances, but are rather much more transformative and long-term. And we have the goal, because we have this participatory board that has direct insight into the front lines and the grassroots, we want to actually make visible those that are chronically underfunded and overlooked, right? So larger foundations often have to deal with a lot of bureaucracy or silos that make it not only difficult for them to identify smaller groups, but also to fund in these amounts. So for us, we want to kind of fill this gap and continuously advocate to the donor world ourselves about why sustainable work can happen and must happen at the local level. And this can look very varied when it comes to movements. It can be things from crafting community safer spaces on a local level to networks of resistance between communities, to documenting violence and discrimination that is very context specific, or to scaling from the bottom up for policy change, as I mentioned with the example of third country nationals from Ukraine. And then Julia, I think the last part of that, and then I'll stop, is why is this transformative? And for us, what we really want to do on the narrative level, on the storytelling level, is to remain true to the analysis of the grassroots. And for that reason, we actually want to encourage a shift and constantly deconstruct within ourselves a move from a humanitarian charity model into one that works horizontally as much as possible and accountably to actually think in a framework of justice and dignity over one's own life, right? And so for us, this is always present at the very local level from the individual people who actually are directly impacted. And it's this narrative that we want to follow and change. As I mentioned, it's completely always an imperfect process, but this is the goals that we continuously have and keep at the heart of our work.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you so much for showing up with transparency on the imperfect process. And it's wonderful to see the possibilities of what can happen when local movements for change are actually resourced and uplifted, especially by people who do have the positionality, preparedness, knowledge, and ability to make a difference. But we know this does not often happen, and models like yours are more the exception than the rule. And so, Miles, I want to turn back to you to help us explore the models that we most often see. As an activist, you have a unique experience advocating both in local spaces for changes to various environments and in global spaces for historically disadvantaged communities. And so I would like to ask you, in our ways of working today as international actors, as refugee response organizations, donors, NGOs, what are some of the barriers to the success of local movement for change? In other words, what kind of challenges inherent to our sector are standing in the way of uplifting local movement for change?
Thank you so much for the question, Julia. I want to start by expressing my sincere gratitude to all the attendees here and also to Cohere for holding this space and to the previous speakers, Anna Maria and Amy, for the valuable insights. Now, to answer your question, I would say whilst some significant changes have been made, there also still remains a lot of challenges and barriers. And I want to highlight three main challenges that we are seeing. First challenge is the series of misconceptions and assumptions linked to INGO refugee-led ambassadorship in global forums. There's a misconception, for instance, that INGO representation by having a director with lived experience of being a refugee is in itself enabling meaningful participation of refugees, right? But the reality is that this director could still be working under oppressive hierarchical structures and colonial structures. And while it might seem like we are really encouraging participation, there is not much that this individual can do in this status quo. And such tokenization also leads to the assumption that we are making progress, when in actual fact, there's not much progress. We're really just reinforcing the status quo. And there's also an assumption that advocating for meaningful participation of refugees globally, I think most speakers spoke to that as well, that if we do this at a global level, it will create tangible impact or outcomes for people at the local level. Yet the reality is that global spaces do not give a straightforward articulation of the local needs. What I mean is that most global spaces are often dominated by generalities, guidance and commitments with less concrete like ways or processes of how to change policies, practices and realities on the ground at the local level for refugees. So while some NGOs, for instance, tend to spend most of their time doing advocacy at these global spaces and investing so much time and expertise, it would actually be more useful if they spent more time coordinating with the refugees or the RLOs, the refugee-led organizations that are working at the grassroots level, those that are the people that are really connected to what needs to change. And those are the experts that probably need more support to change things at the local level and probably minimize time at the global level. It is important, but there is also need for more focus on the local level. The second challenge is the lack of recognition around gatekeeping by NGOs. So NGOs need to reflect on their power. They need to know when it's time to step back. So oftentimes we hear the excuse, the safety concerns of refugees. Oh, refugees need to be protected. They need, they cannot be seen because they need places them at heightened risks. So therefore we step in and speak on behalf of. But I think this narrative needs to shift. There is need to invest in more flexible risk mitigation strategies so that refugees can feel empowered and confident actually to step up and represent themselves and lead, and also be proactive in this process, so that it's really meaningful participation and not tokenization. Because the challenge with this tokenization is that it creates a model of institutional support that is not sustainable. And most of the times it also lacks a lot of community-centered approach. It is not a community-centered approach, because then if we have someone who is probably a director of an RLO project or refugee advocacy project, and the director has no lived experience most of the times, which is what we see, has no lived experience, has no connection to the community, or if there is one refugee who's employed to work on this particular refugee advocacy project, it could be that this refugee becomes the poster refugee of the NGO. So every issue to do with refugees is this one person who is given the work, and that person also becomes that person's narrative becomes the narrative of all refugees. And yet there are diverse groups of refugees. And what it does, it just invisibilizes other refugee experiences. And it doesn't contribute to sustainable movement building, or it also impacts this individual, because then they're overburdened and obviously probably will end up with a lot of burnout. And also when we look at NGO support for local advocacy needs, we see that there is often no connection beyond humanitarianism. So there needs to be more connection beyond humanitarianism. We need to build more relations, not just in terms of focusing on the narrative of victim or savior, but also to move beyond those spaces and create spaces for refugees to engage with other groups. And most of the programs that are provided, for example, for refugees, if there is such, you'll find that it's a training for 1 or 2 days, and with no follow-ups, with no concrete outcomes, how it's going to change people's lives. And these programs are often pre-designed, right, without engaging or including the refugees in the design of the program. So there's no mentoring after that project has been conducted. So refugees issues just become a project, and then when it's done, it's time to close, and then the refugees are left on their own. And this is also linked to the issue that most RLOs are underfunded. And I think Amy already highlighted that. And if refugees are working as volunteers, if at all they get funding, there is no consideration for the mental health, their well-being, and how especially activists at the forefront impacted by a lot of pushback that they witness when doing advocacy work. And one other thing is that refugee leaders also often get like support to travel to these big international meetings without clear guidance or support on what are the concrete outcomes they need to achieve in these spaces. What is it that they should be doing? Who should they network with? So in the end, people just end up in this very big meeting all these big people like states and institutions, but with no clear guidance of how to utilize those spaces, so that whatever they learn there is then translated to their work at the local level, so that they can achieve concrete impact and also really relevant, tangible things for their communities back home. And the third challenge would be...
I'm so sorry to cut you. Just have 1 minute left.
Yes,
thanks.
thank you. Okay. The third challenge is getting funding to local movements. So activists are underfunded and often obscured, And if there is funding, there is no transparency on how to allocate, to access that funding, where is that funding? And funding is always coming in silos. So funding for only one particular issue, the donor's interest, and without considering the intersecting barriers or the challenges that refugees face. And a lot of the times, refugees just end up abandoning advocacy work altogether, because if your hierarchy of needs is not met, you cannot continuously do advocacy when you are in survival mode. You have to support your communities. So yeah, those are the challenges that I'm seeing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miles. I'm so sorry I had to cut you. Thank you so much. You really brought to life the complexities of uplifting local movement for change, and also the complexities that local advocate needs when their needs are not met. Amy, I want to turn back to you to build on Miles' response. Can you unpack, as a founder, why is it hard to get funding to local refugee-led advocacy and movement building?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two different sides about it. One is, as Miles has pointed out so clearly, is that there are very often urgent needs for refugee and discriminated impacted communities that prevent them from building larger power, and those do need to be addressed before we can consider like the sustainable movement at large. On the other hand, what Safe Passage Fund is particularly concerned with is the bureaucratic dimensions behind the philanthropic world, right? So often, as we all know, we need a legal registration for an organization. We need funding to fit into silos and specific issues that have a specific impact for the year. There are a lot of top-down barriers that actually prevent the accessibility to localized grassroots smaller community movements. And that is something that we are aiming to shift and try to be as flexible as we can about. It's something that we're aware of and want to be able to address. So for example, when it comes to the siloed topics, we really believe that there's no such thing as a single issue. Displacement and migration is fundamentally an intersectional issue. And we work with movements that, even if they might not proclaim themselves, for example, as a feminist issue or a climate justice issue, we work to kind of figure out the ways in which these are interconnected, and so that people can actually be able to meet the siloed kind of funding pathways that exist. We also recognize that even the use of English, for example, is quite a barrier for many different communities internationally. And there we would like to work on thinking about language justice and what modes of communication can be available there. We also want to, lower barriers to, for example, monitoring and reporting. I think often, as Miles was saying, there's a lot of pressure on refugee-led organizations to do a lot of the work for funders and donors, when actually we could be doing that work ourselves through, for example, deep listening and compiling the results that we get. So, for example, rather than kind of hound grantee partners with constantly checking in with us, we want to make it as possible as them to do their work independently while doing, for example, annual check-ins, which is a need that we've seen from the grantee partners. And at the same time, we also want to activate the privileges we have in our participatory board of networks to perhaps more established or larger organizations that are located in the so-called global north or otherwise, and figuring out ways where local international groups can be able to be connected or work alongside or benefit from the stability of other organizations, for example, as fiscal sponsors, so that funding can be channeled towards them. I'll leave it at that for now for time.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thanks, everyone. This is the end of the first panel. And so now we'll have this interactive exercise on Slido, and I'll hand over to Diana to moderate.
Hi, sorry, I was muted. Well, we would love to bring everybody into the conversation. So you can join us either at slido.com and put in this code, or you can use your phone and do this on your phone and use the QR code. The question that we want to ask you as a starting point is to build on the challenges that our panelists have started to illuminate for us. And we're really excited to get into the solutions part of this conversation, but we want to hear from you on the challenges before we do that. And so the first question for you all is, what do you think the greatest challenges are in supporting local refugee advocacy or movements? I can see a couple people typing already. As you put in your answers, they should just populate on the screen. I'm going to give you just 1 or 2 minutes to chime in on this, and you can add as many answers as you want. So if you submit one, then submit another and another. And after these answers get populated, we're going to invite our speakers to reflect on them with us. So I'm going to give you just a minute. I'm going to invite you to continue to add as our speakers are responding to some of this. This data is so useful for us as well. We're going to share a little bit at the end of the session about the report that's being generated. So please continue to chime in. It's useful beyond this conversation. Miles, I wanted to turn to you first. So looking at some of these, we're seeing a lot of restrictive local environments. I'm wondering what resonates with you about that. Have you experienced restrictive local environments? Can you help us understand how that might be experienced in practice as we seek to sort of unpack the challenges that local movements face?
Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, I see also the restrictive environments. From my perspective of organizing, especially in Sweden, while the environment is not so much restrictive, what I see is not explicitly restrictive. What I see is there are a lot of barriers that exist, right? Like, so language barrier, understanding of the administrative issues, like how to register, also understanding the systems, taxing. So all these things are also some barriers that really impact exist when it comes to probably if an organization is not registered or well structured, because the structure sometimes for some funders, the structure of the organization determines whether they can fund the organization or not. Probably there's no board, there's no like clear organizational structure as to who is responsible or accountable. So like strategy of the organization, the plan of the organization is not well articulated. This also speaks to, I think, the issue of that I saw highlighted here of supporting on some of the capacities of the RLOs to be enhanced so that they can also be able to receive these funds. Yeah. And sometimes people can circumvent some of these challenges by finding a co-host for the fiscal host, or for the grants, and also having another organization support them with the structures or funding applications, actually, and like NGOs.
Thanks, Miles. Anna Maria, could I bring you in as well? You know, we have quite a few themes and these challenges coming up around training, around funding, around restrictive environments. Which of these challenges is really resonating with you? And do you have any specific examples you could provide us to help bring it to life?
Yeah, sure. Actually, something that we have done a lot in Coalición. And I think the biggest challenge is how donors and donors can invest in the better ways to provide trainings. And this connects with Miles' intervention when he was saying that sometimes pre-pack information, sometimes doesn't fully adapt to the context or to the culture or the language, and this is a huge barrier because in our experience we have done trainings, tailor-made trainings that has worked incredibly effective, and we have seen the power shifting within even a few weeks after those trainings were delivered. So I think it's critical how to address grassroots organizations, community leaders, but also RLOs in a very but to actually invest in that.
Thank you. I will pack so much more, but we have to move on, and we'll get to the solutions soon. I'm sure will help us to unpack. Amy, before we move on to the second question for our community here on the line, I'm wondering what's resonating with you. Obviously, funding emerges as one of the highest challenges. But is there anything you would like to speak to that's particularly alive, or any specific examples you want to provide that helps illuminate the complexity of these barriers?
Sure. I mean, I think what's really sticking out for me, other than the restricted funding, which is very understandable and frustrating, is people's comments about trust and accountability, also the lack of agency for RLOs, larger NGOs thinking that a model won't work without even putting enough effort or resources into them, or NGOs who are speaking on behalf of refugee-led organizations. That's what really sticks out to me, because with our model at Safe Passage Fund, we're actually directly trying to address those issues. And something that we always say is that trust requires two things. It requires action, not just words, and it requires time, right? So really, if funders are able to value the work that RLOs are doing on a local scale and give them enough time to be able to build up their capacities rather than expecting a kind of perfect model right away, I think that these relationships could not only be stronger and lessening the gap between NGOs and funders versus local groups, but also seeing a much more transformative kind of change that can't necessarily be quantitatively measured, but has huge qualitative and transformative impact, I think.
Thanks, Amy. It's really making me think about a lot of what came out in our third session on equitable partnerships and the time investment it takes to build relational ways of working. Thanks for calling attention to that. I want to move us into our second quick question, and that will launch us into our second panel. So in a word or a phrase, how can we as a sector overcome or address these challenges? So you can still be on Slido and add in some of your thoughts on this. And I'm going to give everybody just a minute or two to chime in. Okay, I invite folks to continue joining. I think the words that are popping out, decolonization, trust, I'm looking more at the smaller words around inclusion and accountability are pointing not just to the what of our work as refugee responders, but really the how of everything we do. So I am going to hand it back to Julia to help us unpack the pathways for change.
Thank you, Diana. Well, the purpose of this series is to get really concrete pathways so we can have an operational understanding of the steps we need to take to improve our practices. So we're going to move into our second panel to set the set of very concrete details and insights from our speakers on each of the steps. Feel free to write your question in the chat box in provision of the Q&A or chat them to Diana Essex-Lettieri directly, and we'll get to them during the Q&A. So Diana and I had the chance of working closely with our experts, and we outlined this set of 4 pathways or the concrete steps that international actors can take to uplift local refugee-led advocacy. So I'll present us to these 4 pathways really quickly, and then invite our speakers to give detailed context for each of these. So pathway 1 is orient ourselves to a localization mindset. Pathway 2 is focus on power transfer and power building in local settings. Pathway 3 is participatory grant making for migrant justice movements. And pathway 4 is building local connections to other local spaces beyond humanitarianism. Great. With that, it's time to launch our second panel, starting with Miles, who's going to kick us off on understanding pathway 1, orienting ourselves to a localization mindset. So Miles, in our prep work, you helped us understand that the first pathway to uplift local refugee-led advocacy is work on our mindset as international actors. And we heard this so many times in our interactive workshop series, the need to work on mindset and around equity. But this time you're kind of introducing a new concept, which is working on a localized mindset. So we really want to know what it looks like in practice. So Miles, can you tell us what might it look like in practice for INGOs and donors and international actors to embrace this kind of localized mindset that results in enabling successful local refugee-led advocacy?
Thank you, Julia, for the question. So I could say there are a number of suggestions I could share, and for the purpose of this meeting, I can think of 4, and these are also linked to the challenges that I highlighted earlier. And the first one will be being humble and acknowledging that international actors don't always know about various contexts. So they always, most of the times, they know very little about the context. And the second one is lessening the weight on global spaces. They are important, yes, but invest more time in local groups, local RLOs and local activists. The third point is reframe refugee representation and not just limit it to having 1 or 2 refugees on our staff or on our board and then say we are encouraging meaningful refugee participation, but to have a genuine interest and intentionality to invest and familiarize with the local context and all the refugee communities that exist in that specific context, and not just one refugee that is on our board or staff. And the 4th point is shifting the mindset of saviorism. And it's important to know when it's time to step back and support from behind and allow refugees to lead. For example, allow refugees to lead direct advocacy for meaningful refugee participation. Allow refugees to lead when there's a funding, support them, but then allow them to implement and design projects that speak to their needs and their communities. And for ideas on how to step back, if it's something that you're interested in, and how to deal with the fear of becoming irrelevant, if you want, you can also refer to the COHERE session, the first session on equity learning. I think there will be a link in the chat, or if you can support Julia with sharing that link. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miles. Thank you so much for clarifying this and for highlighting how critical the mindset work is, especially around when and how to step away or step back, and how this is critical to leading to the right kind of support. Ana Maria, I'd like to come back to you for a second pathway. So Coalition for Venezuela's Advocacy impact speaks for itself, and you will present it way better than me in a few minutes. But let me say that you have the perfect positionality for this conversation because you are at both ends of institutional support. You've done a lot thanks to flexible funding, and also you've developed very concrete strategies to support fellow RLO advocates, which focus on power transfer and power building in local settings. So I know you have a pathway to share about this with us today. Can you help us illuminate what it means to transfer power and to build power for RLOs locally? And also, how was it in service to your success and to the success of the RLOs you supported?
Well, I think the easy way to answer this is that we don't want to speak on others' behalf. It's the same that are doing with us, and we don't want to do it with our local NGOs or our human rights defenders. So what we do is with the little of much access we can gain, we have to enhance the voice of those locally leading the responses, and of course connecting this with a bigger strategy. There has to be always a strategy behind. And I can share some examples that might be more useful of how we have done it in Coalition. But for example, on a global scale, it's always hard because there seems to be like they are pushing us in a competition among crises, and it is wrong. It's really wrong. So we are now seeing overlapping of more protracted crises without finding a solution, and donors moving from one side of the world to other, or changing strategies without closing a previous one. And at the end of the day, this impacts directly millions of people, and nothing is solved. But when we have a shared goal, a shared strategy in a long, in a midterm, we can now see in a near horizon how this can work out eventually, even with some of those are left behind. And what we have done is connecting those global scales, those global compass, those tools with the local initiatives, and how to translate this. And for example, also, there is another fact, it's the civil society. It's the only counterpower that governments have to make them accountable. And that has to remain. Then we always try for migrants or refugees to advocate on issues on their country of origin, but also and we have always three paths. Always help others to access into these conversations. When it happens with governments, when it happens with some stakeholders, some private sector representatives, we try always to open up the door, but connects with the second one. Has to be a strategy, a joint strategy. What is the power shifting of this? What is the main goal? How disconnect this with the pre-existing structures? How does this gain trust for you to remain sitting at the table? Because we don't want to open doors just for us, but for those in place. And the third one, I will say that it's always stick next to the local NGOs and to the community leaders. We have preparations in advance, and I can give you some insights. There is in Latin America for several years now an intergovernmental space that was created only by governments. and then was included the UN system, for finding solutions to the Venezuelan crisis. But there was no a single Venezuelan sitting at the table. And they were discussing Latin American policies about how to address border issues, how to attend a humanitarian crisis. I mean, so many things impacting our lives. And we strongly advocate for a seat for civil society organizations. And we gave one as Coalición. So that being said, now we're part of the table. What we do, always came prepared, and yes, we have to showcase what is wrong, what needs to be fixed, but always came with a proposal. And that's something very important for every one of us. And we work together with the local NGOs because everyone has some expertise, everyone has different experience, but we work one-on-one with them to prepare for those experience, to those high-level engagement, to better prepare their policy making. And this has led to incredible changes. For example, before we have done that with the change of the government in Colombia, which is the biggest host country for Venezuelans, they decided to start devenalizing the country, meaning not receiving more Venezuelans. And we are a border country. And every single space for civil society was closed, was shut down. And not a single local NGO can access to talk with any authority. And we did a roundup of introductions. We show what we wanted to do, which is help and to provide solutions, and trying to build the trust of the authorities. Right now, we have so many organizations working in so many levels to provide solutions, especially with municipalities, where the biggest changes is happening. And this is just a few of us that has worked with us, but also we are a network. And as a network, what we always try to have is clear rules for everyone. So everyone is equally important in Coalición. Everyone receives in real time information, and we have democratic systems to elect our authorities, me included. So this gives you a purpose of share knowledge, of constantly training, and also sharing of the tools that is available in other parts of the world that could work in our countries. Those three, just that.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria, for the concrete guidance. Miles, I want to bring you into the conversation here as a follow-on to the second pathway. I know you wanted to complement Ana Maria's point with some specific, rather operational ways international actors can help to transfer power and build power in local settings. So can you unpack that for us, please?
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, so I would say the things that I can share here, the most important thing is that strengthening RLO resilience and sustainability requires humility, investment, time, and patience, right? And there are many ways that can be used to support RLOs complementary to funding, and this is the use of existing structures, networks, and resources. So this includes, for instance, offering your office space. If you have a big office, you can share with the RLOs who normally don't have office space. Transformative solidarity, what does that look like? Endorsing RLO initiatives, supporting their campaigns, using your social capital to strengthen their visibility. You can also use their networks to share their campaigns, or better still, to co-create campaigns together with them, right? Equitable partnerships. So this means co-creating projects. Projects that create jobs, not just as volunteers or beneficiaries, but that create sustainable jobs where refugees can also be paid. Reverse mentoring is also another strategy, where there's always this assumption that refugees need to be empowered all the time, but it can also be the reverse. your team as an INGO could also benefit from mentoring from refugees, from on how to support them on their lived realities, also on other skills that refugees could be having. You could also support with advocacy initiatives, drafting of documents, be fiscal hosts for refugee-led organizations, support them with some administrative challenges like registering an organization or language barriers. Most of the refugees at local level face language barriers. Help them to support funding and also to apply for the funding, and also to how to write reports. You can also co-create processes that encourage transparency and accountability. I think those issues also came up in the earlier slide. And most importantly, space to reflect as an INGO, be willing to be called in when there are challenges and have like an open and a reflective mindset. Invest in the well-being and mental health of activists. Support to mitigate challenges that might come up. Have a responsive strategy to mitigate any emergencies and burnout. And also, lastly, localized investments in risk mitigation strategies for local activists. That means connecting them with different other legal experts, also other organizations and partners in different sectors. Link them to government agencies or other local offices that could support them on different issues, and also continuously explore avenues on how to collaborate with RLOs to enhance their approaches. Yeah, that's what I can share now. And also, yeah, actually for more insight on how you could do this, you can check the Equitable Partnerships, session 3 by WEARECOHERE. And also there's an asylum access toolkit and a position paper that really lays out more suggestions on how to do this.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Miles. It's really great to see that there are many complementary and accessible opportunities to support RLOs where you operate, even if you're not an advocacy expert or a founder. So I'd like to move us on to Pathway 3, which is on participatory grant making for migrant justice movements. And Amy, I'm going to turn this to you. We heard in the last interactive workshop discussions that the mindset shift is also a work for donors. We heard it in the session on equitable partnerships, in the session on funding and institutional support to RLOs. We're going to drop the links in the chat box so everyone can access these sessions. They are available on YouTube. And we heard Miles and Hane from session 4 saying and insisting on the need to get political with funding. And our audience, I think, is really eyes wide open to the complexities of getting funds to RLOs locally in certain countries. So tell us, how do you translate your mindsets into your funding approaches, your funding strategies, and your day-to-day work? How do you deal with the political dimension of funding movements for change in some countries? And how do you overcome the kind of barriers that usually stand in the way of resourcing local movement for change?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So one of our main collective principles is resistance needs alliance. And what we mean by that is actually like, we don't want to dictate how grassroots movements do their own organizing. We believe that they can determine what is the best pathway for them, but we want to be kind of one connected hand in the struggle. And so for us, that means creating a ripple effect that advocates for the narratives, the actions, the emotions, perspectives, and needs of RLOs in the philanthropic world. And that's why we have this model of participatory grant making, which is kind of a fancy word that basically just means people who could be our grantee partners are actually also on our board, and they're the ones who are responsible for co-shaping and making decisions about where funding goes, how it goes, what the reporting requirements are, et cetera, et cetera. So as an example, in our current board, who are just being onboarded at the moment, I think there are at least 2 who they represent organizations that have previously been our grantee partners, right? So at one point, they were ones who received funding, and now they are essentially key and leading the way that the fund will be shaped. this is what we think is accountability. This is what we think is sharing and deconstructing power as a funder. And we really hope that this model is something that can continue to be progressively replicated across other donors as well, so that more and more grassroots have the chance to participate in these processes. It is a process that takes many years. I know for people on the front lines, it can feel frustratingly slow that this change is not happening. But yeah, this is how it is. And we also hope that by having people with lived and learned experience on the board, we're able to get civil society actors and resources in conversation directly with migrant people and displaced communities themselves, to collectively dismantle larger power structures. Something that is concrete is, as Miles was pointing out, finding organizations that become fiscal hosts, right? So trusting in the work that refugee-led organizations and other grassroots collectives are doing, and providing an infrastructure that they might not have the capacities or time to build up, in order for them to do their work. And so by having this kind of activist and lived experience board, we're able to activate a wide network of people who have built trusting relations with us over the years and ask them to provide these resources, for example, to be a fiscal host for a potential grantee partner. Another thing is that often refugee-led movements can be difficult for funders to locate on the ground. And we also think that with this rather structure of people who are actually coming from the grassroots themselves, it is easier to get calls out and to be able to identify and reach those people actually who might not be looking at all the sites and looking at all the Stiftungen or the foundations, sorry. We have open calls. This is something that we do intentionally because we want to kind of disrupt the idea that only identified or sourced groups are able to apply for funding. It adds extra time and labor, of course, but we think that this process at the moment is the way to be the most accessible. And it is the responsibility, I think, of people in certain positions of power to actually take on that extra labor and be able to make it accessible. At the same time, we aim that all our grant-making calls are actually co-shaped by the movements themselves. So we spend a lot of capacity planning in advance to get what we call murmurs from the movements. And this means that we talk with grantee partners, we talk with grassroots collectives, and we assess and get what their needs are, right? So we hear all of their critique. And we think that critique is actually a feminist practice. It's an important thing for funders to be able to receive and to learn from. We don't think it's a personal attack or anything. We welcome critique all the time in order for us to try to grow in the best ways that we can. And by consulting with movements for the period beforehand, we aim to make sure that our calls are actually responsive and targeting the direct needs that are happening as much as we can. And also, I think somebody had previously written in this exercise the frustration about needing to have the right vocabulary, right? Or the right words or the right presentation when you are invited to certain events or when you're doing an application. And we definitely know that that is the reality. And with a board that also includes people with lived experience, we actually strongly want to honor the emotions and the analysis politically of people who are directly impacted, right? So we think that emotions like anger, frustration, grief, these are transformative emotions, and they're key actually to localized communities and their resilient bonds. So for us, we definitely are not looking to be trapped in a specific vocabulary or requiring it from people, and actively trying to be much more creative and flexible around that. At the same time, Julia, you mentioned a really important factor, which is the political dimension of funding movements for change in certain countries. I've been transparent from the start, and I would still love to be transparent now. We started as an organization mostly located in Europe. We continuously internationalize with every rotation of our board, but this also means that we're on our learning journey of what it means to fund internationally as well, in particular in places that have repressive policies that could prevent activists from doing the work that they want to do. Some of the things that we take into account already is that we really embrace the political dimension of safety. So we are always open to hiding the identities of grantee partners when need be. It's not a requirement that we need you to be displayed and kind of boosting our reputation as a fund, not at all. We prioritize safety first and the consent of the grantees first. At the same time, because many of our, or all of our board members are also organizers themselves, they have experience and familiarity to some degree with safety risks that organizers and frontline people have to take. And so it gives us a better grasp, perhaps, than other funders or other organizations where they might not be familiar with the landscape. This is something that we definitely want to keep on working on. We believe that we would like to give trust to the grassroots themselves, that they are taking the risks that they feel empowered to take. We're also open, for example, to doing our best to activate networks and connecting them with strategic or legal consultants when needed. And we're always open to connecting them with, for example, organizations in Europe or in the so-called Global North, if that would help facilitate their funding and help facilitate the safety of that organization. But all of these are, of course, examples of how difficult it becomes to fund people who are in under-resourced regions. And it's a long-term process that we really hope to actively be able to deconstruct and work on. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Amy. I really love your focus on emotions and your application of this feminist principle, critique is care, in your work as a way to improve relations with your partners and your positionality and your work as a funder. So we just have 3 minutes left before opening the Q&A. So please continue to pop your questions in the chat or send them to Diana. But first, Miles, I'd like to invite you to complete our list of 4 pathways with another one that you brought to our attention, which is pathway 4, building connections to other local spaces beyond humanitarianism. So can you speak to this final pathway? Why is it important for the goal of seeing greater institutional support, reaching and uplifting refugee-led advocacy, and how do you do that?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yes, it's important to build connections to other spaces beyond humanitarianism, because this will help to strengthen the social capital of refugees in the context. And if you are already locally based, these are some of the recommendations or things that you could potentially do, which is support refugee placements, for example, in governments, if there is a university where there are PhD studies, if there are some refugees who want to be in these academic spaces, support them to be taking up those studies, include them on boards. We're talking of participatory decision-making, include them on boards, businesses, and entrepreneurship, so that it's not only refugees always working in humanitarianism. Support RLOs. With creating partnership with the same institutions, with governments, with universities, and other organizations, so that this supports them to really feel empowered and confident to conduct their advocacy and policy making and policy influencing in their countries, even in their countries of origin as well, even if they are not in that country. Collaborate with RLOs to sensitize governments on how to support refugees. So especially from an intersectional perspective, really you need to support this initiative and ensure that there is accessibility to funding and ensure that refugees are supported in dealing with some of the administrative barriers that they face while trying to organize. Yeah, those are the things that I can say for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miles. I'm going to hand it over to Diana to facilitate the Q&A.
Hello. Okay, we had a handful of questions come in. I'm going to move us forward. So the first question is actually for both Anna Maria and Miles. Would love to hear from both of you. Starting with Anna Maria, the question is, challenging international NGOs and other actors who gatekeep, including UNHCR, but not limited to UNHCR, can feel really hard for local organizations. because it challenges feelings of safety in the funding, in the fear that you won't be invited to participate in the policy space that you're trying to get access to. So sort of addressing or calling out behavior that feels like it's standing in the way of local meaningful participation can feel really hard. So the question is, what advice or reflections do you have for both the RLOs who might be here with us, but also for the international organizations who might receive that critique from an RLO? What advice would you have for how they deal with this feeling of risk or the feeling that might come from being asked to step back?
Okay, yeah, been there, done that. Actually, it is as much important as gaining access to the table as how you say what you want to say. So language matters, and we have to be prepared for meetings or for any space, and knowing how those people think, what are their goals and then their strategies, and try to connect in any way with them. It's not about our competitions, it's about complementing each other. And of course, there is no one who has more restrictions to access to spaces, to funds, to context, to participation itself than the RLOs. And even so, and this is a fact, this is a strong fact, within the last few years, we have seen how the system has changed by including RLOs. There is significant changes for good. And this has to remain presence in the room. Beyond that, it's not just in consultations, having them travel to Geneva or participating in a side event. It's about how to include those RLOs and those community leaders in every single step of the way, meaning planning, implementation, accountability to affected populations. It's a fact. Sometimes it feels like David versus Goliath, but because we also are competing with the largest NGOs. But it's proven that when we involve affected populations, implementations are more effective. And that's a strong bridge, because we all want the same, finding solutions. So there is an easy way to do it. It's just including us in every step of the way. And also, remind them about the localization principle that they are bound to. Remind them, because sometimes they don't know how to navigate this. They don't know how it looks like from our side. So it's good to have open conversations with all of their respect, but also, frankly speaking, how this will look like for us to be more effective for everyone involved. And yeah, that's just two advices I can give you so far.
Before I jump to Miles, really one quick follow-up question, Ana Maria. Someone is asking, does this advice change when you're talking about gatekeeping that might be happening from host community NGOs, who also might feel left out, who also might feel like they're not receiving the support or deference that they deserve or that they need in order to have the impact they seek? Does it change at all your advice?
It changes. And from the inside, every single institution in the world, it's made of people. So connect at a personal level. You have no idea how much gatekeepers has come to a side once they see how legitimate these things are, how good people is in the practice, and it's just feeling the same. And of course, conversations changes, but address these issues very professionally, but with a gender touch. It's key for opening so many doors.
Miles, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think these are really valid points that are also raised by Ana Maria. Just to add, I would say in terms of really reaching out to, if it's the NGOs and you are an RLO, First, of course, yes, if you reach out and you raise your concerns, there should be that humility from the INGO to really reflect on the feedback that they receive, and they should also be willing and be humble enough to take in the feedback that they are getting, because the most important thing is to think of their why. Why do they do the work that they do? Because if they have a strong why, then it shouldn't be about their egos when they are called in or called out, right? It should be about how do we get to where we want to get. If it's really about ensuring that we have solutions, as Ana Maria said, then it's really important to listen to the refugees and let them engage them, and also let them lead and speak out if they need to. And another thing is that yeah, if there's this transparency and openness and willingness to learn from the INGO perspective, then I think it should be. It's difficult, of course, to receive this type of feedback because it's feedback that challenges structures. These are structural issues, but the first simple step is definitely to be willing to have difficult conversations. Just having that space where those conversations are allowed without retribution to the RLOs. I think that's the first simple step. And really, if you are an INGO with values that are driven by a human-centered approach, then that should not be the biggest concern that you've been called in or called out.
Thanks, Miles. I see a couple of hands. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box. We will have a moment right after this where you can follow any one of your speakers that you're interested in talking directly to into a breakout room, and you can come off mute at that point. I want to bring us to Amy. Amy, there's a question for you. You brought up how important it is for Safe Passage to have found the right ways to have a representation from the communities you support or have supported on your decision-making bodies on your board. The curiosity is around larger institutions who are maybe working in 30+ countries. Can be achieved in a way we would call localized, feels impossible or unwieldy or unreasonable. We can't have our leadership teams or our boards swell to be representative of every country in the world that we work in. So curious how your recommendation around representation specifically might change for a larger institution in mind. Is this a moment for stepping back? Is this just change what we think of as adequate representation? Is it something else entirely?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very great practical question, I think, because it obviously poses a kind of problem for larger organizations. For me, I think there are two different things to think about. One, the framework of participatory grant making is not just about representation, right? That's how it comes off, but it's way more about meaningful participation, which is the entire point of the series, as well as accountability and trust. So for us, our board is currently 5 people. That doesn't mean that we have expertise on every single region that we fund. But what it does mean is we try to build trusting relationships to local actors where we're constantly in feedback with them, right? So our grant making calls are with a wide array of actors who might not be directly on our board, but they nonetheless have a very significant voice in shaping our processes. At the same time, we rotate our structures. So every 2 years, the board will actually change. And the aim of that is directly that no specific group of people is centralizing all the power over decision making. And then with our aim, it's like every single cycle will continuously internationalize, continuously diversify. And in that way, even though we might not be able to encompass all needs immediately at one time, over a longer period of time, we can get a more mutual and larger understanding of the landscape. For larger organizations, I would say that this contradiction should not be something that makes you shy away from trying to engage in more participatory processes, whether that looks like constant consultation, whether that looks like being advised by RLOs rather than the other way around, and also whether that looks like actually investing in intermediary structures, right? So although it's something that you might not have the ability to do because of the large representation, it could be an opportunity to actually deconstruct and shift the power into an intermediary structure that has a lot more connections to the grassroots and has the capacities to do that work. Yeah, but just definitely wanting to stress that difference between representation and actually accountability and trust building and relational building.
Thanks, Amy. That's so useful. We have another question. Also would like to pose this to Miles and Ana Maria. The question is that are there experiences that you could highlight where refugee engagement and policy influence was happening effectively in places where there's sort of a shrinking or a challenged civic space, so places where it can feel unsafe? And this question feels so important because one of the things I think we hear a lot is, well, this international organization has to be leading this because it's unsafe for affected populations to lead something or to be be their own voice in advocating for the thing that they're advocating for. So what would you say to this? What would your pushback or feedback be? And do you have any examples where you feel like it's been done successfully in one of these spaces that might be considered or utilized as unsafe? Go ahead, Ana Maria, and then over to you, Miles.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I can share two specific examples. One, and actually it's very critical because it's both the country borders with Venezuela, which is Colombia and also Brazil. So when the crisis started, the Latin America countries take a step forward to address this situation, but very soon politics changes in the country, in the region, and the new presidents are more linked to the regime in Venezuela. Therefore, starting to closing the borders, starting to shrinking spaces for human rights activists, starting to doing deportations and things like that. So it becomes incredibly pressing for us to protect those human rights defenders. So what we've done is to try to link them with some international actors and raising those flags at the highest level. Say, listen, this is happening and this is wrong. This is violating so many international rules, and documenting that. It's very political, but increase the cost of their actions. That being said, we're starting in a bottom-up strategy with local authorities that they can provide at least some protection for those local NGOs and community leaders. And that was the game changer, because actually who receives thousands of Venezuelans through a border are the cities. And the national government takes too long to find a solution, and they move forward and start to connect with us. Of course, we always very clear, very looking forward for solutions. We said, listen, we have to work together with this, but we need your assistance in this. You are the local authority. And so far, we have gained 19 spaces of one-on-one dialogues with so many municipalities in Colombia that has changed it all. From shelter systems to health system access, including further documentations and things like that, including things like validation of credential for professionals in order to step down of very complex vulnerability situations. So it's very tricky, the question, but I think things can be managed in that way and navigate through political times. It's about all, yeah.
Miles.
Yes, to add, just to chime in on what Ana Maria was saying, I will share I will respond to the part where you were asking about what we are seeing in terms of these security concerns for activists or RLOs. Yes, they can be security concerns, and sometimes and often, depending on the context, definitely. As we saw some of the context where it's really hostile or volatile, they can be security threat. And I think the most important thing would be for these supporters or NGOs to really actually invest more in mitigating these security threats and not just making them more amplified and therefore stepping in on behalf of. There should be more mechanisms or structures put in place to support activists who are facing threats and also to mitigate these threats, right? So creating more partnerships in using their resources to make sure that activists are feeling safe and are protected, and strengthening the advocacy work as well in those contexts by supporting the activists whenever they face pushback, for instance. And also when we talk of security, most of the times we're just thinking of external things that happen to activists. We're not also thinking about the threats of burnout that happen when we get activists to work for us for free, the threats of burnout that happen when we put activists to work under colonial structures, which they cannot change anything. So that is also, even within those INGOs, activists face threats. So that also should be considered, and there should be mechanisms to allow people spaces for rest, to recover, to recuperate, and also to feel replenished and supported. So threat should also be looked at broadly. Yeah, thank you.
Well, we have about a dozen unanswered questions. I'm going to hand it over to Julia so that we can figure out how everybody's questions can get answered in breakout rooms.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. We're so sad we had so many questions, but because of time, we have to move to breakout rooms. So I'm now going to open the breakout rooms. Once they're open, please select which breakout room you would like to join. Each of the speakers will be in their own room, talking about the pathways they shared. So you can go and ask them questions about today's content, unpacking details. Feel free to jump around from a breakout room to another to see what's going on with other speakers. And in the breakout rooms, please raise your hand to ask questions, and you can also use the chat box. Each speaker will have a buddy to help them out to facilitate the conversation. We encourage you to ask your question and then step back once you had your turn, to leave room for others to contribute. And a quick disclaimer before we go. These are horizontal ecosystem level conversations about today's content. So this is not a forum to ask, for example, a Safe Passage Fund about funding opportunities, but rather to discuss how donors are or are not meeting specific local advocacy needs. Speakers do not have all the answers, so we are all here to learn and improve the ecosystem together. So on this, I'm going to open the breakout room and see you back in 10 to 12 minutes. Here you go. You can join your breakout room.
Okay.
Have you received an invitation to join a breakout room?
Oh.
Not yet.
Okay. So if you haven't received the invitation, you can go in the plus or the three dots in the Zoom bar at the bottom of your screen on the right normally. And then you go up to breakout room. I see people are joining. You click on it, and normally the free breakout rooms will open.
This is room 1, right?
It's called breakout room with Miles.
Oh,
So I think it might be room 1, yes.
Yeah.
If you do not receive the invitation, you can go on the Zoom bar at the bottom of your screen. and then you go on the three dots or plus. You click on plus or on the three dots, and you go up to breakout rooms. You click on it, and then you'll see that there are 3 rooms. Breakout room with Miles, breakout room with Anna Maria, and breakout room with Amy. It's working, Miles, for you?
For me, I see 3 rooms, and there's no breakout room with Miles, and there's just okay, now I'm invited.
Oh, I just invited you. For the other ones, is it working?
Hi, Julia. I'm wondering if there's a permissions problem. I'm looking at the list and nobody is in a room unless you're a host.
Mm. Okay.
I think we could invite
Siennois.
everybody back and just keep the Q&A going in the group for the sake of
Okay.
time. What do you
Okay,
think?
okay. Yeah, let's do this.
You want me to just keep moderating Q&A for another 5 or 6
Please.
minutes, Julia?
That'll be great. That would be great. People are joining.
Great. Hi, everybody. Just a note that we were having some issues with permissions for the breakout rooms, and so we're just going to continue Q&A as a large group. So just wanting our speakers to hear that. Miles and Amy and Anna Maria, did you catch that?
Got you.
Okay. Well, I had a question for Amy. Amy, are you with me here?
I think you might want to start with Miles because Amy and Anna Maria are still transitioning from the
No,
room to the
here I am.
plenary. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, great. So, Amy, one of the things that you brought up in your pathway discussion was the importance of international institutions building the networks or supporting the building of networks of local movements for change. And, you know, as somebody who has run larger international organizations, sometimes making space to be that connector, that convener is unexpected or unanticipated from staffers. And it can feel this feeling of burden from international workers. And so my curiosity is about safe passage and how it's creating an intentionality and a space for its staff to prioritize this as a core part of its success of its employees' time.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we're a super small team. So on the one hand, we are always coming up against the limit of capacities. And we have a progressive model that we understand is not necessarily in this moment easily replicated on a larger structural level to, like, for example, NGOs that already have long time kind of structures. Nonetheless, we want to advocate for investing and resourcing these kind of more participatory structures. We consider staff not only for their competencies, but also for their connections already to existing grassroots movements. We generally consider ourselves like an entire team of migrant justice organizers coming from different backgrounds, different identities, but all with a kind of committed cause. So generally, it's not something that we necessarily see as a burden, but actually part of the work anyway, part of the necessary work. At the same time, we also try to find ways where the actual board can be empowered to help us facilitate and make those connections. So we have an internal working group, for example, where we constantly talk about the idea of wealth and what that means from different perspectives, including, for example, frameworks like decolonizing wealth. And this is a continuous like political education process that hopefully for us sets the ground and the intention that the work of connecting with local movements, that the work of foregrounding migrant voices is not just peripheral or an added task, but actually needs to be essential and the time needs to be taken. in order to do this work. Yeah.
Thanks, Amy. That's really useful. I have a question for Ana Maria around the role of international actors in promoting local network building or local coalition building. So the question is, from an international positionality, so somebody who's sitting at in a headquarters seat or a regional leadership seat for an international INGO who wants to be a part of supporting and uplifting local networks. What does that look like? How could they have the right knowledge or approaches in order to be a useful support to the development of local actors if they don't necessarily have the relevant local knowledge?
I think it depends of the network itself, because every network works differently. In our own way, we just always try to raise the voice of the others. So every single time Coalition shows up into an event, global actors know for a fact that there has been a consultation behind that. Okay, we have done our own internal processes to gather information, to provide solutions that fits to that conversation. But it's a mid-long-term game, because we need to gain the trust and maintain that trust with so many stakeholders. But it depends of the quality of what you're offering. Very often I've seen other networks that just sit in a table and rant about what is wrong, and that just lead to a dead end. You have the obligation to point out what is wrong, what is not working, but you can also have the access to provide a possible solution, and that's an incredible opportunity. Once they see that, more opportunities comes, and of course there is always some misunderstandings or disagreements. That happens everywhere, but in the way we can provide solutions, we will be seen as allies, not as the competition.
Thanks, Ana Maria. Miles, I have a question for you, again around safety concerns, and again around how the how of international actors or non-refugee-led groups of promoting the safe participation of various groups. And this question, I think, is a good fit for you because of the incredible work that you have done advocating and enabling the participation of LGBTQ populations. The question is specific around what does it look like to be creating safe space for participation of women and children. We could expand this question to be any intersectionally, additionally marginalized population within the refugee community. What advice would you give for someone who is trying to create that kind of extra safe space?
Right, thank you for the question. Yeah, it's a very important question. So yes, as you said, probably what I would say is that, yeah, in my work, what we normally say in my work is that we cannot guarantee safe spaces. So we try from a grassroots activist perspective to create braver spaces where we acknowledge that we have different positionalities as people, and that there will be things that can happen in the space, but we come to these spaces with the intentionality to create spaces where everyone feels welcome to come in their full authenticity, but also where we acknowledge our own privileges, and that at certain times we are also in positions of oppression, but also we can also be oppressors, and really interrogate our own powers as we come to spaces, and also really looking at from an intersectional perspective. That's the first thing, because the way that people experience vulnerability depends on the other intersecting social positions. So it could be women, but then if you have lesbian women in that same space, they could be experiencing more oppression. If you have people living with disabilities, or if you have elderly people, And so all these multiple layers, we have to really look at them. So yes, consider the diversity of the people that you're going to serve in this space. And also, most importantly, probably key is involve the group, really engage with the group. Ask them, what does being brave mean to them, or safety, whatever that mean to them. So engage the group, because what this is will depend on different contexts, on the different groups that you're dealing with. If it's LGBT people, you have to look at a number of things. You have to acknowledge that people are coming into spaces with different backgrounds, different convictions, different traumas, or also different expertise. So really work with the group to see some concrete solutions. But also, of course, if you are an NGO, invest, right? Like invest resources into that space. So this could be human resources, it could also be financial resources, it could be networks. Connect the group with other support systems like psychosocial support, connect them with resources, as I said, for mitigating the challenges that can come, or the pushback that can come with being at the forefront. Also provide spaces where people can always go if there's like burnout, or if people are experiencing some breakdown, so that they get the support they need. But most importantly, communicate with the group and ask what safety looks like for them.
Thank you. And this is our last question, unfortunately, and it's going to go to Ana Maria. Ana Maria, there's a question really about how to train people well to engage in advocacy. And because of your specific positionality as both running an RLO network and having experience running an RLO yourself, I'm curious how you know when you're supporting other RLOs, how do you know that the training you're providing is of value to the communities that maybe aren't from your own?
Drafting in advance. What do you want to learn? What can be useful for you in your country? And for example, we took an example of a program called Refugee-Led, and we redrafted completely to the Latin America context and what the teams were needing. So we did this with basics of diplomacy, with the strategic communications, inter-American system of human rights. So it's very, very tailor-made. And once a year, we try to gather in one single space, which is our General Assembly. And this is a very, very important space for us, because we always try to learn together about good examples that can be used in several countries within coalition members, but also trying to bring in high-level experts that give us those tools. So preparation has to be tailor-made, and afterwards, we always do follow-up. Has it worked? Needs to be changed? What has to be changed? What are the results of this? And for example, for the Refugee Skill Up, we just gained 5 different access to different boards within the countries. The Brazilian Board for Human Rights, the Curitiba and Paraná Board for Migrants and Forcibly Displaced People, the Human Rights Council of the City of Buenos Aires, and also the Intercare for Elders in Colombia. And I'm missing someone, and also participating in the Cartagena Plus 40 consultations with all Latin America, specifically providing proposals regarding protection issues. So that's a key indicator of things are working or not, or has to be changed.
Thank you so much. Julia, back to you to close us out.
Thanks, everyone. My colleague Daniel is going to share the exit survey in the chat. Can you please fill it? It will help us a lot in improving this series or next versions of it. As a final step, I just want to give 1 minute to each speaker for their final thoughts. Starting with you, Miles, can you please present your 1 minute wrap up?
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And yes, my final words, I would say the most important important takeaway if the RLO, if RLOs are here, but also most importantly, NGOs, consider having a more community-centric approach, involve communities, acknowledge and respect the urgency of refugees to lead, decolonize, support initiatives where you can include refugees in decision-making processes. And lastly, listen, involve, engage, collaborate, reflect, adapt, and have the humility to know when to step away or step back and let refugees lead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miles. Anna Maria, what's your 1 minute wrap up, please?
Investing in the RLO movement, it's more cost effective. It's the right thing to do, but it's the must thing to do. And this has to be been taken very, very seriously. From every side, from donor side, if they want to see changes, real changes in short time, but also from our side to take this with the highest responsibility and be prepared for those challenges, because the world is changing and we need to be up to the task. So everyone deserves a chance. Everyone has something important to contribute, and yeah, it's the right thing to do and the smart thing to do.
Thank you, Anna Maria. And last but not least, Amy, your 1 minute final wrap up, please.
Thank you, everybody, so much for being here and for organizing. I think the main thing that I would like to say is that donors clearly have a role to play as well. Our listening and deep listening to RLOs cannot just stop at that, but it actually must move towards action, towards advocacy, and making a narrative shift so that the analysis and the needs of the RLOs are actually welcomed on a higher level as well, also when it comes to financial resources and other kinds of accompaniment and support. And to everybody here who's actually part of an RLO or a migrant community, I would say, please honor your own visions. Your frustrations and your complaints are valid and necessary for the changes that we want to see in the end. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, Amy. And next, Diana, you're so key to this workshop series that I completely forgot to introduce you. Could you please introduce yourself and speak about some of the next steps following our interactive workshop series?
Yes. So I'm Diana Essex-Lettieri. I'm the founder and lead consultant of Diana Essex-Lettieri Consulting. I'm about to put my LinkedIn link in the chat box. If you want to find me to do any work together, please find me there. I focus on the intersection of strategy and equity. It has been an absolute joy to collaborate with Cohere on this project, and learning from people like Anna Maria, Miles, and Emmy has been the highlight. The series, if you haven't caught it all, is available on our YouTube channel. Go check it out. And we are really curious about what happens next. So what happens next could be additional workshop series. And if it is an additional workshop series, we're really curious in learning what topics we want to unpack further. I think one of the things Julia and I have taken away from this is that the conversation lacks nuance, and that by hearing from people like Emmy, Anna Maria, and Miles, we get to really understand the complexity of the conversation. It was never as simple as the meaningful participation agenda would have had us believe at the start of this journey. So we want to keep going. We would love to hear from you on what the next pieces of that conversation could look like. For sure, there will be a report that highlights the expertise of each of the 5 series, each of the 5 sessions that we have had. We expect that will be out in the next few months. We will share it broadly, and we will ensure that if you RSVP to any of these workshops, you will have access to that report. Julia, anything you would add?
That's all. I think I would give the last words to Edmund Page, who's the director of Cohere, who hosted this series. So Edmund, your closing word, please.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great opportunity to be able to say some words of thanks, first and foremost to all the participants that have joined us within this interactive workshop series. The level of engagement has been beyond what we could have dreamed of, and it's been brilliant to have you all come along, share great questions, meaningful participation and refugee leadership. I would like to very much thank the experts that we've had in this series. It's been so fascinating to hear people with the level of expertise and insights that from all the guests that we've had in these workshops. As Cohere, it's been a privilege to be able to host this series. I've personally learned a huge amount from it, and I know that everyone at Cohere has as well. And I feel that the conversation has been able to move forward in the way that Julia and Diana were just talking about, in terms of adding nuance and really getting into some more concrete and technical ideas as to how to move ahead with the how of these topics. Thanks to everyone from the Cohere team for the work behind the scenes, and to the IKEA Foundation, among other donors, that have made this possible. And lastly, I'd like to just say a huge thanks to Diana and Julia, who have really been the creative force. And Julia in particular has had this idea of creating this workshop for actually quite a few years. And there was a lot of work in the build up to making it happen. And I think for all of those who've been involved, will see how meticulously each event has been organized in advance, during and after. And so just a very huge thanks to you for making this all possible. And like you've said, I'm excited to see where these conversations go next. So I'll leave it there, and thanks so much, everyone. Until next time.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. We'll be looking forward to opportunities to reconnect. Bye. Take care and talk soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.